Do your client have rounded shoulders and been told that it has to do with tight muscles? Today we'll be talking about a reason why that may not be the case. Hi, I'm Alex Zeffer, founder of Resilient Training and Rehab, and I've helped thousands of practitioners from around the world get faster and more consistent results with their clients. Today we're going to be discussing the role of the rib cage in how it relates to rounded shoulders. We're going to be talking about the internal anatomy of the lungs and how everything from the inside out can actually be a major player in why somebody may be rounding their shoulders. So before we get into the actual mechanism of the rounded shoulder, let's talk a little bit about the rib cage and its relationship with the scapula. The rib cage actually has more of this convex structure. And so the reason why that's important is because inside the scapula, it's a little bit more concave. And so we need the scapula to fit on top of the rib cage, kind of like a puzzle piece. If there's any type of flatness, then that congruency in that relationship is not going to be there. And so the scapula is going to move on the rib cage and find a position where it can actually lock in and find a rounder part of the rib cage. And so inside the rib cage, we have these massive lungs. And so when we breathe in, the the front part of the rib cage opens, so does the back, as well as the side will open. So we get this 360 degrees of expansion. So the chest expands, the rib cage expands, the posterior rib cage expands, and the lateral rib cage expands. And that allows for the scapula to maintain on the rib cage as we move into different degrees of shoulder flexion. At this around 60 to 120 degrees of shoulder flexion, that is when the scapula, the only time the scapula is going to move on the rib cage. And so when that happens, this is also the range where we express a lot more internal rotation of the shoulder. Why that's important is because oftentimes what I find in my experience is that most people create this rounded shoulder position because they're missing some degree of internal rotation. So this rounded shoulder position is a compensation for that lack of internal rotation. And so what inherently happens is they get some tension on the front part of the rib cage. And I'm not talking about muscles necessarily. I'm talking about how the internal structure or how the lungs can expand or can't expand and how the rib cage is rotated. So if I've got a rib cage that is turned towards the right like so, in order for that to happen, this anterior chest actually needs to compress somewhat so that I can turn the rib cage back towards the right. Why that's important is because if this part of the rib cage can't expand, then if I need to do something where I'm producing force or I'm internally rotating and requiring this area to expand, then I'm going to do it in one other way. I'm going to try to position the socket in a way that allows for that motion to happen. And one of the ways it does that is by anteriorly tipping, which basically just means the scapula is coming up and over the rib cage, anterior tipping, and you can see when I do that, the socket now faces forward versus if we were to squeeze our shoulder blades, you can see how it moves away from you and actually faces backwards. So if I anteriorly tip the scapula over top of the rib cage, because potentially we've got some tension on the front part of the rib cage, then we are going to be in a position where every time we want to do a press or do a row or do something that requires some degree of force, I'm going to further anterior tip the scapula. So this doesn't necessarily have to do with tightening of muscles. Muscles are secondary to what the joint is doing. So the muscles are involved for sure. But if we just think about muscles, then all we're going to be doing is stretching the muscles. And I have found that that doesn't really provide long-term relief. It may open up some range of motion really quickly, but the stretching is not going to create the shape of the rib cage that we're looking for. And that shape is for the anterior part of the chest to be able to open. So if I can find exercises that can shape the rib cage in a certain way to allow that to open, then the scapula is going to be able to downwardly rotate versus constantly being in this upward rotation and anterior tilt. So now when I'm assessing this, I'm looking at a movement like the Apley's, which essentially just means that I'm taking my arm, I'm extending it, I'm going to be adducting, which just means coming towards the midline, and I'm trying to touch the opposite shoulder blade. And oftentimes what you see with these people who are rounded, as soon as their arm goes back, their shoulder rounds even more. And again, that is not surprising considering the fact that this chest is already going to be compressed. And so as they move into extension, this scapula is going to come up and over the rib cage even more. It's very similar to a pelvis that is dumping forward, right? The pelvis is anteriorly tipping. That is then going to limit my degree of hip extension because I'm kind of already in some degree of hip extension or some degree of shoulder extension. So now when I get them to do this, I can see exactly, or I stop the test exactly when they start to roll. For some people, it's immediately as they go behind them. Other people, it's as they get towards their middle part of their back, right? Sometimes if people don't have this rounded shoulder, they could be able to touch the opposite shoulder blade no problem without any rounding. But again, with these people who have rounded shoulders, it's important to understand how much range of motion or how much internal rotation we have to work with so that we can pick the most effective exercise for them. So now when we're thinking about exercise solutions, there's a couple principles that I want you to keep in mind. Again, what we need to think about if we want to improve internal rotation of the shoulder, one of the most important things to consider is that the sternum and the humerus actually have to move away from each other. So if the sternum and humerus move towards each other, that's when you start to get this compression in the front of the chest, right? Because you've got the humerus and you get the sternum moving towards each other. So we want them to move away from each other. And so when this happens, this is a thoracic rotation, or I'm turning to the other side. That's going to create the space in this anterior chest wall. Okay? The second thing to consider is because the scapula is coming up and over the rib cage, and this front part of the chest is more compressed, because the whole rib cage is going forward, the back part of the rib cage is also going to be tense. And so I've got this anterior and posterior tension, so the front and back tension. And so every time I want to go into shoulder flexion, I'm going to have a lot more limitation because, again, I've got this wall of tension in the front. If I want to go back into extension, I've also got this wall of tension in the back. And so as I go into extension, the shoulder goes forward. So really the only position I have is more in this frontal plane. So I have to think about exercises that are not only going to be in this frontal plane, but exercises that are going to facilitate more compression of the side, because if I compress the side, then the front and back will begin to open. So I got to do exercises that are not only going to facilitate more serratus, but just creating the shape of the rib cage that allows for that chest to expand. So for the purpose of this, we're going to assume that my right shoulder is more rounded. And so what we're going to do is we're going to create an exercise that is going to allow for this lateral rib cage to be compressed so that the front and back of the rib cage can open. I'm then going to further create more tension here by performing an exercise like a lateral fly on the left arm. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a pad. This could be a half foam roller, this could be a pillow, this could be a towel. And I'm going to lay it down so that I can lay my lower part of so I can lay the side of my rib cage on it to create a little bit of that bending shape. Again, I'm going to compress that lateral rib cage so I can open up the front and the back. So I'm going to place this towel or this pad underneath my rib cage, and I'm going to stick my arm so that it's facing forward. So I'm going to find a position where it doesn't feel like I'm shrugging. So if you feel like you're shrugging, then just bring the arm down a little bit. You're then going to stack up a couple pillows or a couple yoga blocks so you can rest your head, because I don't want your head to be side bent like this, or I don't want you to be side bent the other way. I want it to be as straight as you can. So this lateral part of the pad is going to push the lateral part of my rib cage up and create more of the side bending through the rib cage, not through my stomach or through my pelvis, but compress my rib cage. I'm then going to take this dumbbell and I'm going to perform a lateral raise. And what this is going to do is as the dumbbell comes up, it's going to put more weight into my rib cage. It's going to push my rib cage further or harder in towards the ground. So I'm going to take a big breath in through my nose. I'm going to breathe out as I go up. I'm going to hold here, take a big breath in through my nose. And what you feel in this position is as I breathe in, the air is going to go into the pad. But then because I'm blocking it with this pad, it's going to now go front and back. So it's going to become more of this anterior or front and back expansion of the rib cage. So again, I'm going to breathe in, breathe out, move. Breathe in here, breathe out, come back. I'm going to perform about 2 sets of about 8 reps. Okay, so for this exercise, it's going to be oblique sit with a lat pull down. And by having my arm into this higher oblique position or having my arm straight in the side or that frontal plane, so beside me, not in front, not behind, but beside me, again, I'm going to be in that range that we discussed. I'm not going to be able to flex my shoulder, extend it, but I can go out sideways. And so this is going to be great because, again, I want my humerus, my arm, to turn away from my sternum. I want them to move away from each other. So as I pull the cable down across my body, my chest and my rib cage is going to want to turn towards the left. As I come back, I'm going to turn towards it. So I'm going to open up my back part of my rib cage on the right in this position. As I exhale, I'm going to push my arm, my right hand into the ground. So I'm pushing myself to the left as I pull my arm down towards my left leg. So I'm going to take a big breath out as I pull. Breathe in here. Feel that right chest stretch. Breathe out. Return. So I'm basically going to breathe out as I move. Big breath in here. Breathe out. Breathe in. Breathe out and return. And you do about 2 sets of 8 breaths. If you found this helpful, don't forget to like, save, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.